Mike Ormsby, U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Washington.
Mitch Barker with the Sheriff's and Police Chiefs Association.
The first thing we did is I walked them through the various structures you can use in an investigation and a filing. We talked very briefly about how we don't really do grand jury in the state of Washington. And there's pretty good reasons about that. You look at the elements of a crime, that applies to everybody. You look at whether self-defense is present, that applies to everybody. And then that subsection 3 of 9A16040 says that you shall not file against an officer in the course of duty for the use of deadly force, absent malice and a lack of good faith. And that is different than it is in other situations. Tragedy if somebody ends up dead. And they very clearly went in and said, we're going to put a higher standard in because we don't want officers to be held individually criminally liable, and we are expecting that there's going to be civil compensation.
To try to address the fact that there's just widespread, and I believe totally false belief that cops are going to cover up for other cops. Because I've been at this 30 years and I haven't seen it. They're generally law-abiding.
And the fairly inflammatory videos of obviously horrible police interactions, all somewhere else. And it's an uphill struggle. You know, I found people that talk about what we're doing in Washington. We're doing pretty well. We're not perfect. We're doing pretty well, a lot better than a lot of states.
You know, I think that the point to make is we're looking at a civil rights definition, and kind of the analogy we use is we have one charge, and it's probably the most difficult charge to prove. It's the deprivation of civil rights, and the standard is pretty difficult to achieve.
I hope the legislature isn't going to be stampeded through media or whoever else is presenting this, so that we have a different view of what goes on in the state of Washington vis-a-vis the rest of the country. I think that's a very dangerous thing. I've been reviewing these cases for almost 44 years, and I've seen a lot of these cases, more than you like to see, but I think the restraint and the training we have in our state is just outstanding.
We have a legislative committee that can meet quicker by phone if something does come up, and I think the association's going to need to have a position.
We do be thinking about, we're not going to, it will come up, and pretty much we have to have an opinion on this. It is a filing standard directed to what you all do, so we need to think that through.
Jim?
I think when this bill was passed, originally the legislature realized that police are going to be going into, just as Mark said, they're going to be going into dangerous situations. When you call, if you find somebody in your home in the middle of the night, and you're terrified, you're going to call, you're not going to be calling the ACLU, or you're not going to be calling any of these other groups of the media, you'll be calling the police. And when they come, they're going to be confronting someone who may be armed, and they may be really endangering their own lives. So the legislature looked at this when this law was passed and built those safeguards in it. I think it serves well, and I think that standard should stay.
There is the legislative recognition of a dual standard that Mark and Dave were talking about. That yes, we do have a different standard for police officers and the general public. And the general public actually has some other protections that may be broader than what police officers have in some situations, and then the police officer has broader protections, is given some protection here. And I think that has to be the foundation for any evaluation of this. We recognize there needs to be a different standard, and we don't accept that the standard would be the same for police officers as it is the general public.
Different kinds of forums in my community to not only give me a chance to kind of hear the reaction of the community members and get a sense of the feelings that this generates in a certain community. And I've also met privately with a few community groups that have had very strong interest in this, and I know at least one that's very interested in a legislative change. So I'm totally anticipating something's going to be coming forward. But just general comment, when you step back from this topic of use of deadly force by police officers, there is a bigger, broader issue here about significant distrust that lies out there in certain sectors of our community, and be that whether that's driven by certain cultures or certain types of economic levels, whatever that is, there is a significant amount of distrust among groups, at least in my community. I can't imagine I'm unique in that regard, with law enforcement. That drives a lot of this discussion.
I just think there's that element that, and we just went through this at the legislature yesterday in a work session. We don't trust you. What can we do? What, you need to build trust with us. Great. Give us some steps. 4 years ago, adopted this new. Great. We want to build trust with you. How do we do that? You need to build trust. And we just go in this big circle. There is a certain group that no matter what, because they've got a dog in the fight of making sure there's a problem to continue that.
You mentioned body cams. Do you anticipate more movement in the legislature?
I don't. We had a 2-hour work session yesterday, and I came out of that pretty convinced that there will be no movement.
Kind of piggyback on what Larry said, we get really focused on the word malice and that Washington is the only state with that. I'd be curious if any of the counties that have had an officer-involved shooting, if that ever hampered anybody, where it was like, man, I would charge this guy but for that malice, because it doesn't seem so. You know, during my time in our office, luckily not as elected, the 2 shootings we have, it would make no difference. So I'm just kind of curious if that almost becomes a red herring. We get really focused on malice, when really it's maybe more the overarching policies that John touched on. So.
It makes you wonder what evidence would prove, what would it look like to actually have concrete evidence?
Right.
Facebook post later, or?
Doesn't it just sit out there and potentially have the possibility of messing you up on a case you do want to charge or pursue on? I mean, so it's one thing to say it doesn't change anything to get rid of it, but what I would say is if it's just hanging out there and we don't know what it means, isn't the potential for it then to be a problem where, you know, do we have to wait for a case where we say, oh, that's why malice is a bad standard to have as something we have to affirmatively prove? Or should we talk about that now and say, well, maybe we should get rid of it so that never happens? Because, you know, and I don't feel real strong about one or the other, but I do think that's the counter argument, which is, but if it doesn't seem like it's that operative, why should we have it in there? I hate stuff that we don't know exactly what it is, because I feel like all that can do is maybe thwart you on a case that you want to pursue. So I just think about that.
Any other comments?
I was going to say, you know, since we got some members of the public here and we're all talking about what things, maybe we ought to ask them.
Well, we're not doing public comment today because we have a long agenda, but